I made the video on the Basenji and how these dogs must have been the ones that were found in ancient Egypt, and how they must have contributed to a lot of things that were done at the time, including police raids and general guardianship. And of course, the companionship of dogs is something that human beings have known for a long time. But in Egypt, we know that there were companionship with, you know, monkeys, cats, giraffes, all kinds of animals. But I did leave out one location, and that was the rest of North Africa. And this was kind of done on purpose because why not? Now, this place is North Africa in general, especially Tussle and Naja, the place where we find a lot of similarities between the pre Bantu people and the people living in North Africa in general. Now, why is it that the Bantu people are important? Well, first of all, we're talking about a dog that came from Congo being found in North Africa. Now, the people of North Africa are thought to have come, a lot of them, from the Middle East. But people in the Middle East have had dogs since the Ice Age. So why is it that their dogs are not being represented, but instead a separate dog is being represented? One that is from Congo. Two reasons. One, the Bantu migration, I think some people misunderstand this migration. They think that the giant Bantu migration means that people who were genetically related to the Bantu people did not ever travel before that time, but instead it speaks to a specific type of culture which traveled. Not that people who were related to these people genetically never went anywhere. In fact, we do know they went places. We've seen their DNA all over Africa. If we look at a lot of studies, but this time we're going to look at one specifically because I want to go back to the dog. But if we look at them, we can see that there's a lot of mixing. And of course, Africa has these sort of genetic people who are like sheltered off from one another. So it has to be explained that at some point, though there's mixing and matching, there was isolation for some people. But Central and North Africa is not that place that you should pick as your example of genetic isolation. There is genetic boil down, to where it doesn't look like there's large diversity, but that happens after there was genetic diversity. So if we read Ancient DNA, New Light on Africa Stone Age, the oldest DNA yet isolated from humans in Africa reveals long-range migrations around 50,000 years ago, which likely played a role in the Middle to later Stone Age transition. Ancient dating to between 16,000 to 18,000 years ago, the oldest human DNA to be extracted in Africa so far reveals that populations of hunter gatherers mixed and mingled 50,000 to 20,000 years ago, moving long distances across the continent. This supports the idea that demographic changes played a role in the transition from the Middle to the later Stone Age, a time when new types of tools emerged and information was exchanged over long distances. This is a very exciting paper because it shows that it is possible to extract ancient human DNA from samples of human bone and teeth from Africa dating back to at least 20,000 years. What is equally exciting is that the authors have managed to obtain genome-wide data, which means nuclear DNA, the highly informative section of our genome. Tom Hyman, an archaeologist at the University of Vienna in Austria, who was not involved in the study, tells the scientist in an email. This has allowed them to explore much more ancient evidence for relatedness and admixture among populations dating back to around 80,000 years ago. While the first complete Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA genome was sequenced in 2008 from a 8,000-year-old individual excavated in Vindaja cave in Croatia, scientists only recovered the first DNA from human fossils in Africa in 2015. It's really hard to get DNA out of the tropics because heat and moisture kill DNA. A bioarchaeologist at the University at Alberta and co-lead author of the new study tells the scientists and the researchers have been limited in how much they can learn about the past sequence DNA of modern humans because of the last 5,000 years, the spread of hunting and farming, the enslavement of African people, and the colonization wrought dramatic demographic changes. It completely obscured the ancient genetic variation, says Saul Chuck. In the new study, she adds, we wanted to see what the genetic landscape in Africa looked like before the roller coaster of the last 5,000 years, but we didn't have much ancient DNA from the time period. This allowed the researchers to delve into long-standing questions. For example, at about 50,000 years ago, a change in the archaeological record is seen, which remained a decades-long mystery in African archaeology. According to Sawak, we could see archaeologically that the people had started creating what we thought were long distance trade networks. For instance, obsidian, a type of stone particularly suited for making tools, was moved over long distances. We can also we can look at the chemistry and see that the stones have moved. The question has always been, were humans moving them with them? The researchers looked at the ancestry of six newly sequenced individuals and 28 others individuals who had lived between 8,000 and 4,000 years ago in various parts of sub-Saharan Africa and whose genetic data had previously been published. Surprisingly, all 34 individuals were descended from the same three genetic lineages from Eastern, Southern, and Central Africa. The fact that all of these individuals are descended from the same three lineages suggests that the past we had this big period of mixing and moving, explained Showak. It was a it was a tens of thousands of years process that involved many people moving over many generations. It was a transformation in the way that hunter gatherers were living in Africa. Based on genetics, the author concludes that this wasn't just things moving around. This was people moving long distances, taking Eastern African ancestry all the way to the tip of Southern Africa and Southern African ancestry to Ethiopia, and then Central African ancestry throughout. Soak says the only way this can be explained, she adds, is that people were moving long distances and finding patterns far away from their birthplaces, creating what she calls globalization and changing the genetic landscape. We would have never seen this without DNA. Well, ain't that something? Imagine that. African nations or African peoples moving around the entire continent, sharing information and resources with one another. Could that be the result of why an animal like the Basenji could be found all over the continent? The answer is obviously yes. And because, of course, you don't just move dogs on their own, especially if they're tame like the Basenji are, but instead humans move with them. And remember the thing that I made? There was a whole video about Chad that I made. There was something to be said about Central Africa as a special place in Africa. And I remember saying, calling it the heart of Africa because it seems like every single group sort of either contacts or spreads out from the Central African areas. And to know that there are studies confirming this makes it really interesting. But since it's the end of the year, I guess I don't mind repeating this. But there's something to be said also about the linguistic similarities that we see between languages that have nothing to do with each other in Africa. Like, remember the word ma that I was talking about that had to do with the word water. The fact that we find aman in the Berber locations, the word amanzi in Congo and the Congolese regions, so we call them Bantu languages. But like I said, this Bantu expansion has nothing to do with, pre-Bantu people. Even though they would have been genetically related to the Bantus, it's about a specific type of culture that we see being traceable. And then we go to the Sudanic regions and we find the word ma'a or ma in Nubia, old Nubian language. And of course, the word ma in ancient Egyptian is one of the words for water. And then we have alma or ma in Arabic, another Afro-Asiatic language. So every single group in ancient Egypt, in Africa, had this word for water. But not only that, then they have a similar word for dog, as I stated before, iwa or imwa, in all of these regions. And of course, we have more and more and more examples of this. Like, for example, that roundhouse that I was talking about in Per, right? In ancient Egyptian, it's Per. In in I think some Semitic languages, Afro-Asiatic Semitic, it's bait. In Africa, it's isbai. In Nubian, it's bai. In West African, it's ba. All these words that have to do with a round house. Now, these linguistic connections would seem to have no evidence prior to, you know, let's say before 2017, there was no reason to believe that African languages shared anything with each other. I mean, they're different languages, of course. Now, some of them that didn't share with other languages, I'll get back to that because they did share with other languages, but one that didn't share for a long time were the Khoisan languages because they were very isolated in a sense, and even their culture seemed isolated. They weren't, but they seem like they are because the people of Khoisan look very different than the other people in Africa. But again, looks can be deceiving. As we can see, there's other people in East Africa. We always hear this thing of like the only people that were in Southern Africa were the Khoisan. Not true. There were also the pygmies that lived in that region. And as you can see here, based on this study, there were East Africans who traveled south. This is one of the reasons why the Hadza was nominated as an Afro-Asiatic group by that other dude who champions the idea that um, Afro-Asiatic started from the Middle East because he wanted to find this Afro-Asiatic group that went through Ethiopia and came down. Turns out that the Hadza language is actually more related to, it's not fully related. It's not even, it's almost 0% related, but it is still related to Bantu languages. And the words that they said were Afro-Asiatic turned out they were just Bantu words, which speaks to something important. The fact that he was looking for words similar to Afro-Asiatic words, but they turned out to be similar to Bantu words, tells you how close a lot of these words are to each other anyway. Now, these pygmy people, I'm just going to call them that for simplicity, these pygmy people have a language of their own that is different than Bantu languages, that is different than Afro-Asiatic, that is different than, you know, all these other Niger languages, Congo languages, all of them. But some of them have click in them. They have like the Khoisan click, and some people think that it developed twice. My estimation is that doesn't make any sense. that right next to each other, two languages developed, click languages. Clearly, they must have one of two things: come from a common origin or shared with each other. It doesn't make sense that it just in Mozambique, in Kenya and upwards, you see the language that is very, very similar in a way that no other language in the world is to every other Southern African country. Today they called countries, but region in Southern Africa. It doesn't make any sense. So let's quickly talk about the people from East Africa and how, for the most part, most of the history, they were a pure Negroid race. And this debunks a lot of weird things that people say. For example, one of the weird things people say is that the result of East Africa is that of um, foreign Muslims. Not true. But we don't need to talk about that exactly. First, let's go back to what the paper was saying, which was that the people are obscured in the middle of our time because we had so many migrations. Even now we have migrations, but Africa, to me, it's not interesting because those slave migrations, including modern migrations and troop movements, I don't think it was a coincidence that so many migrations were happening in Africa at that time. I think it was just continuous throughout its history. The people were just moving around, and Africa is not the only example of this. Of course, there's many places. Remember, the people of North Africa are nomadic, and they have been for a very long time. So this means they would have run into other people from other places all over the world. And remember, another thing is that North Africans themselves, they have been connected with Black Africans for a very long time, even if we count the modern world, right? The people who are mixed with Arab Muslims, even they do not fully separate themselves from the Africans, but instead talk about this history. In fact, I remember watching a video where a guy asked, why is it that the North Africans are so light in skin? And the guy said, well, it was because of the Romans and then the Muslims and all of that stuff. No one really mentioned them being there like 20,000 years ago, as some people have suggested. The Middle Eastern 20,000 years ago thing does not tell us anything about what they would have looked like. I mean, people in the Middle East probably didn't look like what they look like today, 20,000 years ago. But let's continue with this migration thing. So, cattle is found very early in Africa, and then it's just passed throughout Africa. What does this speak to? Migration. I spoke about Chad and how a lot of the art forms from Chad just spread out from that one region. And we don't even need to look at the images or go deep into it. But remember, studies are just coming out and out and out, pushing this idea that was once by some people thought ridiculous. Now, the movement throughout Africa, as this study shows, and as many other studies show, brings up the immediate question: what about Egypt? If Africans have been passing things through from one place of the continent to the other in sometimes one generation, then what does that mean for Egypt? Well, easily the answer is, as is above, so is below. The same things that were happening in Central Africa were happening in North Africa. People were just moving in there, bringing in all kinds of things, which we can see, all kinds of artifacts, including African headrests. I haven't spoken about these in a long time, and there's also new ideas about these as well. Now, I want to state nothing that I talk about it being only found in Africa. Remember, some things that humans make, I mean, we made writing several times in history. So just because something happened in Africa doesn't mean it didn't happen anywhere else. And just the same with moving stones and stuff like that. As we read over there were people were moving rocks from one part of Africa to another thousands of years ago. Now, what does it speak to? It speaks to somewhat more developed civilization than what we used to think. You always hear some people, and I've heard people say this before, you always hear people say, what would Africa had been like had it not had other people come in? And to me, that question is like asking, um, what does water taste like if human beings and other animals don't drink it? It's a very pointless question because we know that the giant development everywhere is due to people coming from different locations around the world and growing those civilizations. If you want to know what they would have looked like, they would have looked something like what we have today, just with a lot less bloodshed. Now, obviously, there would have been a more leaning towards Africa, as we see in the Kingdom of Congo, as we see in Kilwa, as we see in ancient Egypt, as we see in North Africa, as we see in Mauritania, as we see in the Chadic civilizations, the Sao civilization. It would have had a more leaning towards Africa, but it would have still been something very similar to what we have today. And the funny part is Africans aren't outside of the development of what happened today. I mean, I've shown you a lot of African American scientists, and I've shown you Africans who developed things that then were taken by Europeans. The world we live in today is as a result of fusion from many civilizations. But there are obviously some sacrifices. For example, modesty, the hyper-modesty, was introduced by the Middle Easterners to the rest of the world. And again, I said there was a picture that I saw of a Muslim, a traditional African, and a Christian from the 1960s or something, and they were sitting in the same pit working on, I think they were grabbing gems or whatever from the mud. And it was interesting to see the Muslim woman who was hyper covered, the Christian who was in the middle, and then the almost naked African person. And for me, it spoke to the fact that Africans did kind of choose their path because they did have a choice. It's not like there wasn't anybody who, they had a choice. And a lot of them chose to go the modern route, and we can choose to go the other way today if we really want to. It's not like African discoveries are dead. Okay, but let's go back. So we now know that there's full migration, but how far back does it go? Well, according to that, it goes back tens of thousands of years. And of course, we know that it probably goes back hundreds of thousands of years, which is why, if you watch the PBS documentary based on actual genetic studies, it's like the PBS documentary is the king, but based on genetic studies, it's not it's not hard to find the most, like, the oldest people are first thought to be somewhere in South Africa, and then they're thought to be in East Africa, and then they're thought to be in North Africa. It's not hard to find out why that happens, especially if you consider the fact that we've been moving for hundreds of thousands of years. Again, obscure. The only thing that's obscure is the want to put people in a single location, to say, okay, so this here location here is where the Zulus come from. The reason why the Zulus have a history in East Africa and a history in Central Africa is a result of this constant migration. It's the same reason why Egyptians have a history in Central Africa. It's the same reason why West Africans have a history in North Africa. and even southern Africa. But some people aren't ready to hear that information.